But at the same time, what appeared in such a public perspective was constantly contingent upon the particular positions that bodies assumed while being viewed. They were never viewed in the same way because, again, as I said before, making a neighborhood, making a district was about making different angles, different openings, different enclosures. So people always had a different take on things when they appeared in the public, because the public wasn't one thing, the public was many different things. The public provided many different angles upon how you could see and listen and be with each other. So given that these positions were so materially and architecturally diverse, it was never clear just exactly what was being seen once it was seen. So to see you in public didn't necessarily mean a kind of consensual take on who you were, because being in public, your being in public meant that you were being in public in so many different ways that it was not so clear what I was seeing when I was seeing you. So the possibility to witness each other without necessarily being one thing that is to be witnessed. So relations were devices that always register the momentary passing by. Even if people deal with each other day in and day out, relations were to always be invented anew. But relations were always something to take note of. So these were some of the critical kinds of elements about being in relations that were critical to what was life in majority districts and the notion of majority time. But the problem is that this is changing, and it's changing in very radical ways. So what we mean by deep relationality now even changes as something not between people. That is, a sense of deep relationality is the capacity to exteriorize intricate histories of people working with each other, deciding, thinking through things. That is, the capacity to put these things onto apparatuses of calculation and formalization, to make them matters of algorithmic decision-making, to exteriorize them from our own capacities to deal with each other into a kind of logic and formal system which decides for us, decides the relations for us. So determinations of who can do what with whom under what circumstances and what can be produced from these efforts is increasingly subject to a form of relationship making taken over by increasingly integrated systems that render experiences of all kinds into some form of interoperable data. Interoperable data is, for people who work in municipal government, metropolitan government, this is the key buzzword, interoperable data. How can we make different kinds of data speak to each other? Data that couldn't be compared, data that couldn't be related. How do we make them speak to each other so we can get a kind of decision about what it is that we're supposed to do? So this is data that can be compared across different kinds of locations, bodies, and operations. So thus, in some ways, because of this, we don't even have to talk about specific identities anymore. We don't have to talk about black people. We don't have to talk about white people. We don't have to talk about any particular kind of people. Rather, we have the capacity to target anomalous movements and the constitution of dangerous subjects through probabilistic calculations of composite data. That is, the identity of the body, of the person, doesn't mean as much as the identity of the composite that is the product of this kind of interoperable data. The composite body is not a human body necessarily, but it's a kind of abstract body that gets mapped onto particular kinds of people and converts them into particular kinds of dangers. So there's an emphasis on speculative subjects, on urban derivatives. You know, it's the sort of the language of finance being translated into the language of social governance. And these derivatives do not so much embody the contents of specific identities, but target the ambulatory implications, the movements of those previously known through such identifications as black or Puerto Rican or whatever. So we don't have to talk about targeting black people. We talk about targeting particular kinds of movements, because those movements tend to be associated with black people, we can end up targeting black people. We don't have to talk about targeting black people. At the same time, to render more and more space and things and people subject to the eventuality of being enfolded as an all-encompassing fabric of capitalist practice or urbanization, itself increasingly requires complex constellations of actors and processes. And when these are put together, who knows what can happen? What new eventualities might ensue? I mean, to keep the capitalist game going, we need new kinds of needs, new kinds of consumers, new kinds of things that are, and those new consumers have to be invented in some ways. So we have to make new kinds of socialities. We have to connect people in different kinds of ways and constitute those connections as new kinds of social subjects. But when we do that, we create eventualities, a kind of sense of things that could happen that we don't really know, we don't have a kind of language for. More and more, when I look at urban development projects across particularly Southeast Asia, I find that urban development is less interested in the profitability of development projects. It's less interested in developing precise calculations about future scenarios. Rather, more and more, it seems like capitalist practice urbanization wants to control the capacity to give rise to eventualities no matter what they are, regardless of whether they're profitable or not, no matter what shape or behavior they might assume. That is, more and more power becomes the capacity to create a volume. And volume means a kind of collecting relationships of all kinds, make a volume out of many different kinds of relationalities as a way to be able to bring about something, the capacity to simply bring about something, the power to bring something about. And that power is less interested in what it brings about. It's more interested in the sheer capacity to do so. So in some sense, much of infrastructural development not only constitutes a guess about where the city is going, but it elicits the possibility of being part of a cascading and lateral chain of significations and realignments, not necessarily imprinted with the weight of particular causations or history. That is, it's about creating a kind of time beyond time in a way, the sheer sense of somehow instigating a kind of time that is set loose from any calculation, a process of associating people and places and institutions and finance and politics that ramifies in unanticipated ways. That is, in a very serious and significant way, the game is not profit. The game is about creating a time that has no relationship to any previous time, the power to bring this about. And this is a kind of fundamental change in terms of the urban landscape. And so what that means is that sense of relationality, of making things through relationships, of making things relate to each other, somehow has become something very dangerous, foreboding, and very much incorporated into a kind of a capitalist practice urbanization. And so then what? What becomes our kind of stance? What becomes our kind of mode of analysis? Well, in one way, a book that got a lot of attention last year by a Congolese author, Fiston Mwanzin Mujula, a book called Tram 83, which is a fascinating book about city life. And he may be writing about Lubumbashi in the Congo, but who knows what he's writing about. He never identifies a city. And the whole book is simply a book of details. It's simply a book of a proliferation, a profusion of details. And of course, it's very incredible details, and you read them, and you go from one to another, and you're moving along a world where you don't know where you are, but you're fascinated all of the time. And all these details are ungrounded. They're not anchored anywhere, but of course they're not alone. They're next to each other. They're not alone. So it's details that are unanchored but not alone. So how did all these details get to be in the same room, we ask? Where did they come from? Where can they go? Each offers its particular lines of flight or neighborhoods of uneasy settlement. Nothing is offered in this book to settle anything definitively. And it also, as we get into the book, it defers our need to find out anything for sure. And most importantly, it circumvents the romance with integration. That is, all of our sort of past liberal sentiments about integrating things, integrating the details of everyday life, making all the details get along, the romance that everything could be integrated. Perhaps this is a romance that we need to get rid of. Maybe it's something that was no longer possible and is not something to be aspired to at all. So overarching narratives, acts of subsuming, are inoperable. Details may carry the traces of the relations that constituted them, but the details are free from serving in as locked-in evidence of a particular dispositions, and instead these details can be seen as secretions that may mix and congeal in ways that go beyond any of our available vocabularies. So the point becomes, how do we live amongst these details? And perhaps it is a matter of adopting different ways of sensing that navigate through the details as weird alliances. And what I mean by weird alliances is things that might be going on, things that might be going on without the obligation to marshal specific forms of verification. To live in the sense of the might be without necessarily having to prove that what might be is what actually is. And how to live in that kind of time. You know, to shift the notion of time from what is going on to what are we experiencing, what might be happening, and living the what might be happening without necessarily having to prove that it is what is happening. And so strange alliances between particular kinds of built environments. We tend to see these as these two, the foreground and the background is divided. In what ways are they allied with each other? What ways are the objects in these pictures not simply the results of different time,